Ambassador Lee Miho stood at the observation deck of Harmony Point Station, watching the stars through the massive viewport. 3 years of his life had gone into this moment. 3 years of careful negotiations, late-night discussions, and delicate compromises. The Terran Galactic Peace Accords would finally give humanity a real seat at the galactic table, not as newcomers begging for scraps, but as equals. The station buzzed with activity as delegates from dozens of species prepared for the historic signing. Miho adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform and checked his notes one final time. Everything had to be perfect. This treaty would change everything for Earth and her colonies. Kim Soo-young, his chief aide, approached with her usual efficient stride. She had been with him through every negotiation, every setback, every small victory that led to this day. Her dark eyes held the same mixture of excitement and nervousness that Miho felt in his chest. The Rillan delegation just confirmed they're ready to proceed, she reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Their colony ships are maintaining formation just outside the system, waiting for signing to conclude before continuing to their new settlement. Miho nodded. The Rillans were peaceful farmers, seeking nothing more than fresh soil and open skies. Their inclusion in the Accords represented everything the treaty stood for: protection for the innocent, cooperation between species, and hope for a better future among the stars. Through the viewport, he could see the distant lights of the Rillan colony ships. Hundreds of families aboard those vessels. Children who would grow up in a galaxy where different species worked together instead of fighting endless wars. It was worth every sleepless night, every frustrated argument with stubborn delegates. Park Ji-ho, the military attaché assigned to the diplomatic mission, joined them at the observation deck. The soldier looked uncomfortable in his dress uniform, clearly preferring battle gear to ceremonial clothing. But even he seemed moved by the historic nature of the day. 20 minutes until the ceremony begins, Ji-ho announced, checking his chronometer. Security sweeps are complete. All delegates are accounted for. The main assembly hall filled with representatives from across the galaxy. The insectoid Kethrin delegates clicked and chirped in their musical language. The massive, rock-like granite collective members stood silent and patient. Even the mysterious energy beings from the Nexus Confederation had sent an avatar to witness the signing. Miho took his place at the ceremonial podium, the treaty documents displayed on holographic screens for all to see. Cameras from dozens of worlds recorded every moment. This would be broadcast across known space, marking humanity's emergence as a true galactic power. Today, Miho began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall, we take the first step toward a new age of cooperation and understanding. The words felt right, felt true. After centuries of small conflicts and misunderstandings, the galaxy's younger species were finally coming together. The treaty wasn't just paper and legal language. It was hope made real. Then the alarms began to sound. Kim Soo-young's communication device chirped urgently. Her face went pale as she listened to the incoming reports. "Sir," she whispered, "we're receiving emergency transmissions from the Rillan ships." The massive view screens in the assembly hall flickered and changed. Instead of the peaceful ceremony, they now showed the darkness of space where the Rillan colony ships had been waiting. But the ships were no longer alone. Massive warships had appeared from nowhere, their crimson hulls gleaming under the distant starlight. The vessels were enormous, easily 10 times the size of the largest human dreadnought. Their design was angular and aggressive, built for one purpose only: destruction. The peaceful Rillan ships looked like toys beside these monsters. Their simple transport vessels had no weapons, no shields strong enough to matter. They were farmers and families, not soldiers. The first energy blast lit up the darkness like a newborn star. Then another, and another. The Valtor Empire warships fired without warning, without mercy, without pause. The Rillan colony ships disappeared in brilliant flashes of light, taking thousands of innocent lives with them. The assembly hall fell into shocked silence. Delegates from across the galaxy watched in horror as an entire peaceful expedition was wiped out in moments. The massacre was being broadcast live across known space during what should have been a celebration of peace. A new voice filled the hall, cold and arrogant. Supreme Commander Thexval of the Valtor Empire appeared on the screens, his reptilian features showing no emotion whatsoever. His scales were a deep green that seemed to absorb light, and his eyes held nothing but contempt for the assembled delegates. Inferior species require management, he declared, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been challenged. This is simply pest control. The weak exist only to serve the strong. Miho felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, that remained unbroken, but something else, something he had carefully maintained throughout his diplomatic career. The part of him that always looked for compromise, that believed every conflict could be resolved through patient negotiation and understanding. Park Jill's hand moved toward his sidearm, the soldier's instincts taking over. But Miho raised his hand, stopping him without looking away from the screen. Violence wasn't the answer. Not yet. But as the ambassador's mind began to catalog every contact he had made, every favor he was owed, every weakness he had discovered in 3 years of careful observation, the Valtor Empire had made a critical error. They had just given a human diplomat with intimate knowledge of galactic politics absolutely nothing left to lose. The careful diplomat was gone. In his place stood something far more dangerous. The diplomatic suite that had once hosted elegant dinner parties and quiet negotiations now looked like the nerve center of a galactic war. Within 6 hours of watching the Rillan massacre, Miho had stripped away every piece of ceremonial decoration and replaced it with something far more dangerous. Maps covered every wall, but these weren't military battle plans. Instead, they showed the complex web of relationships that held galactic civilization together. Trade routes snaked between star systems like glowing arteries. Political hierarchies branched out in colorful charts that revealed who owed favors to whom across dozens of worlds. Kong Hyojin sat at the center of it all, her fingers flying across multiple communication arrays. As his intelligence specialist, she had always been good at gathering information. Now she was working with desperate intensity, connecting dots that others couldn't even see. The Nexari Trade Coalition is absolutely furious, she reported without looking up from her screens. The Valtor attack destroyed 3 of their shipping convoys that were passing through the area. They're calling it an act of war against neutral commerce. Her voice carried a note of excitement that would have seemed inappropriate to anyone who didn't understand what was happening. Each piece of bad news for the Valtor Empire was another weapon in Miho's growing arsenal. And the Keth mining worlds? Miho asked, his own fingers dancing across holographic displays as he composed messages to contacts across the galaxy, already sending requests for military support contracts. Hyojin confirmed. They want to buy weapons and higher protection. Lots of both. Miho nodded, filing away this information as he crafted his responses. To the proud Velnari warrior clans, he sent something far more valuable than money or weapons. He shared classified intelligence about Valtor fleet movements, positions, and supply routes. Information that would let the warriors strike at their ancient enemies with devastating precision. The Velnari had been fighting the Valtor Empire for generations, but they had always been outnumbered and outgunned. Now they would have the one thing that could even the odds, perfect intelligence about where and when to strike. To the starving frontier worlds on the galaxy's edge, Miho offered something completely different. Advanced agricultural patents and terraforming technology that could transform barren rocks into garden worlds. In exchange, he asked only for military staging rights and the use of their strategic locations. It was brilliant in its simplicity. The frontier worlds needed food production technology desperately, and they had nothing to lose by opposing an empire that had never cared about their survival anyway. Yoon Tae-yoon, the economic analyst, looked up from his data streams with genuine amazement written across his face. He had been tracking the ripple effects of Miho's messages, watching as they spread to the galaxy's financial and political networks. "Sir, you just triggered 17 different mutual defense clauses," he announced, his voice barely containing his excitement. "The merchant guilds are mobilizing their private security fleets, and even the crystalline communes are offering material support." The young analyst paused, studying his readouts more carefully. "I've never seen anything like this. Species that have been neutral for centuries are suddenly taking sides. The economic impact alone is going to cripple Valtor's war machine." Miho allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Most military commanders would have focused on building fleets and gathering weapons. But he understood something they didn't. In an interconnected galactic economy, information and relationships were far more powerful than any battleship. While Admiral Choi Jisu prepared humanity's conventional forces for war, Miho was orchestrating something far more sophisticated. He wasn't just building a military alliance. He was turning the galaxy's entire social and economic structure into a weapon pointed directly at the Valtor Empire's heart. Song Myaung, who specialized in monitoring enemy communications, looked up from her station with a grim smile. She had been tracking Valtor military channels since the attack, listening to their internal communications and strategic planning sessions. "Their high command is in complete chaos," she reported with obvious satisfaction. "They can't understand how their enemies are suddenly coordinating so effectively. Their intelligence services are reporting impossible things. Species that should hate each other working together, trade routes being rerouted overnight, supply lines being cut with surgical precision." She played back a brief audio clip of Valtor officers arguing among themselves. Even through the translation software, their confusion and growing panic was obvious. "They keep using the same word," Myaung continued. "It translates roughly as impossible coordination. They're convinced someone has developed new military technology that allows instant communication across the galaxy." Mio's smile was thin but genuine. The Valtor Empire had built their strategy around the assumption that the galaxy's younger species would never truly work together. They had counted on ancient rivalries, economic competition, and simple distance to keep their enemies divided. They had never considered that a human diplomat might understand their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. The Empire had always seen diplomacy as a sign of weakness, a tool used by species too cowardly to fight directly. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. In the hands of someone who truly understood how galactic civilization worked, diplomacy wasn't weakness. It was the most devastating weapon in the galaxy. And Miho was just getting started. The Valtor Empire had built their war machine to fight one enemy at a time. Their strategy was simple and had worked for centuries. Isolate a target species, overwhelm them with superior firepower, then move on to the next victim. They had never faced anything like what was happening now. From every direction across the galaxy, coordinated strikes hit Valtor interests simultaneously. It wasn't random chaos or lucky coincidences. Someone was orchestrating this with surgical precision, turning the Empire's own size and complexity against them. Aboard the diplomatic vessel New Seoul, which had been hastily converted into a mobile command center, Miho watched the galaxy burn around his enemies. The ship's main conference room had been stripped of its elegant furnishings and filled with tactical displays, communication arrays, and real-time intelligence feeds from across known space. Han Jaiwoo, his logistics coordinator, worked at a massive holographic display that showed supply lines and resource flows throughout Valtor territory. Her job had once been ensuring that diplomatic receptions had enough food and proper accommodations. Now she was starving an entire empire. "The blockade of the Zirian system is holding perfectly," she reported, manipulating the display to show shipping routes being systematically cut off. "No Valtor supply ships have gotten through in 4 days. Their garrison there is completely isolated." The beauty of it was that Miho wasn't using human ships to enforce the blockades. Instead, he had convinced local species that their own security depended on stopping Valtor resupply efforts. The blockades were being maintained by people who had their own reasons to hate the Empire. Nam Seojin looked up from his communications station with barely contained excitement. The Althan pirate clans just hit another supply convoy in the outer spiral. That's the 5th successful raid this week alone. Miho nodded with satisfaction. The Althans had been raiding Valtor's shipping for years, but they had always been scattered and uncoordinated. Now they had detailed intelligence about convoy routes, schedules, and cargo manifests. What had once been random piracy was now precision warfare. "The Empire's outer rim forces are running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition," Seojin continued. "Their commanders are sending increasingly desperate requests for resupply that their high command can't fulfill." The holographic battle display showed the true scope of what was happening. Red indicators marked Valtor military units that were stranded cut off, or operating at reduced capacity. The Empire's vast military machine was grinding to a halt not because of enemy firepower, but because it couldn't feed itself. Traditional military thinking would have focused on building bigger fleets and fighting direct battles. But Miho understood something that the Valtor commanders didn't. In an interconnected galactic economy, controlling resources and information was far more effective than controlling space. Bei Ji-hyun, who managed their intelligence networks, suddenly looked up from her station with barely contained excitement. "Sir, we just confirmed something incredible. The Valtor Fourth Fleet has mutinied." The room fell silent. A full fleet mutiny was almost unheard of in galactic warfare. Military units might surrender or retreat, but they rarely turn against their own command structure. They're demanding back pay and supplies that their government can't provide. Ji-hyun continued, her voice growing more excited as she read the reports. The fleet commander tried to maintain discipline, but his own officers arrested him. They're calling it a military reorganization for survival. Miho smiled grimly. The Valtor Empire had always maintained discipline through fear and overwhelming force. But hungry soldiers with empty fuel tanks were harder to intimidate than civilian populations. Every alliance that Miho had carefully cataloged during his diplomatic career was now a weapon pointed at the Empire's heart. Every trade agreement had become a noose tightening around Valtor's economy. Every cultural exchange program had become an intelligence network feeding him information about enemy weaknesses. Dr. Shin Woo-jin, who led their psychological warfare efforts, approached with a data pad full of analysis. "The cultural pressure points we identified are working better than expected," he reported. "Valtor society is built around the concept of inevitable victory. When that certainty starts to crack, their entire social structure becomes unstable." Supreme Commander Thex Val's propaganda broadcasts had grown increasingly desperate over the past weeks. Where once he had spoken with absolute confidence about Valtor's superiority, now his messages focus on temporary setbacks and the need for greater sacrifice from civilian populations. But Miho had already turned the Empire's own communication networks against them. Carefully crafted countermessages spread through Valtor space, highlighting military failures and questioning the competence of Imperial leadership. The same networks that had once unified the Empire now carried doubt and dissent to every corner of their territory. Lee Daeung, who monitored enemy internal communications, looked up with grim satisfaction written across her face. Their colonial governors are starting to panic. Several have already reached out through back channels, asking about separate peace negotiations. She played back intercepted communications that showed Valtor regional commanders discussing the possibility of surrender. These weren't frontline military units. They were the administrators who kept entire star systems functioning. The empire that had seemed unstoppable just weeks before was hemorrhaging worlds, ships, and credibility at an exponential rate. And at the center of it all sat a human diplomat who had turned the galaxy's complexity into the most devastating weapon anyone had ever wielded. Miho looked at the tactical displays showing the Empire's collapse and allowed himself a moment of cold satisfaction. They were learning what happened when someone who truly understood galactic civilization decided to take it apart piece by piece. The news reached Miho while he was reviewing supply disruption reports in his command center. Kim Soo-young burst through the door, her face pale with shock and horror. She didn't need to speak. The emergency broadcasts were already filling every screen in the room. New Busan was gone. The peaceful agricultural world had been home to 3 million human colonists, mostly farmers and their families who had spent generations turning the planet's rich soil into food for dozens of star systems. They had no military installations, no strategic value beyond their grain exports. They were as innocent as the Rillan families that had died weeks earlier. The Valtor Empire had used their planet-killer weapon without warning. One moment New Busan was a green world dotted with farms and small cities. The next moment, it was nothing but glowing debris scattered across space. Miho watched the footage in absolute silence. His team gathered around him, waiting for orders, waiting for some response to this ultimate escalation. But for long minutes, the diplomat who had orchestrated the systematic destruction of an empire simply stared at the screens. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than anyone had ever heard it. But there was something in that quietness that made everyone in the room take a step back. "Give me everything," he said softly. "Every war crime, every violation of galactic law, every piece of dirty business the Valtor Empire has hidden over the past century. I want it all." Something fundamental had changed in Miho's approach. The cold, calculating diplomat who had been systematically dismantling the Empire's military and economic power was gone. In his place stood something that terrified even his own allies. Victory was no longer enough. He wanted justice served with surgical precision, and he wanted the entire galaxy to witness it. Jo Hyunwoo, the team's legal expert, had always been thorough in his research. Now he worked with desperate intensity, building case files that would have impressed the most demanding courts in known space. His encyclopedic knowledge of galactic law became a weapon as deadly as any fleet. "The Calirian massacre in 2387, he reported, reading from files that the Empire had tried to bury. 16 million civilians killed when Valtor forces pacified a rebellious mining world. The trade and biological weapon incident. The systematic enslavement of the Koran species. Each crime was carefully documented, cross-referenced, and prepared for distribution. But Miho wasn't just collecting evidence. He was preparing to destroy the Empire's very right to exist as a galactic power. Kim Min-sik, who coordinated with media outlets across the galaxy, worked with chilling efficiency. He understood that different species would react to different types of atrocities. The key was presenting each crime in the cultural context that would generate maximum outrage. To the reptilian Isatar, he sent detailed reports about how Valtor forces had deliberately destroyed spawning grounds on conquered worlds. For a species that considered protection of eggs sacred, this was the worst possible crime. The hive-minded Zefkari learned about the Empire's practice of severing communication links between colonies, isolating populations before destroying them. For beings who shared consciousness across vast distances, this was torture beyond imagination. Every species in the galaxy received evidence of Valtor, crimes specifically chosen to horrify their particular culture and values. What had once been buried history became a weapon of mass destruction aimed at the Empire's reputation. Oh Seoyoung, monitoring public opinion across dozens of worlds, watched the numbers change in real time. Their legitimacy rating has dropped to 12% and falling, she reported with grim satisfaction. Even their traditional allies are publicly distancing themselves. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. The Neutral Arbitration Council, which had maintained careful neutrality for centuries, issued an unprecedented statement calling for the Valtor Empire's complete and unconditional surrender. They're not just calling for an end to hostilities, Oh Seoyoung read from the official statement. They're declaring that the Valtor Empire has forfeited its right to exist as a sovereign power under galactic law. Miho studied the intelligence reports flowing in from across Valtor space. Their military was collapsing, their economy was destroyed, and now their political legitimacy was gone. But that wasn't enough for him anymore. Dr. Shin Woo-jin approached cautiously. Even the psychological warfare specialist seemed unsettled by the change in his commander. "Sir, we're receiving surrender offers from 17 different Valtor systems. They want to negotiate separate peace treaties." "No," Miho replied without looking up from his work. "No separate treaties. No negotiations. Complete surrender or complete destruction." He was performing surgery on an entire civilization, cutting out his capacity for aggression with the precision that only a human could achieve. Every institution that had supported Valtor expansion was being systematically identified and eliminated. Every cultural element that glorified conquest was being exposed and discredited. When the final intelligence reports confirmed that even the Valtor Home Guard was refusing to fight, Miho allowed himself a thin smile. The empire that had murdered 3 million innocent farmers would never threaten anyone again. But his work was far from over. Victory was just the beginning. Now came the harder task, building something better from the ruins, ensuring that this kind of tragedy could never happen again. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you gave a human diplomat not just a reason for war, but a reason for justice. The great hall of the former Imperial Palace on Valtor Prime had once echoed with the arrogant proclamations of supreme commanders who believed their empire would last forever. Now a house some in the galaxy had never seen before. a ceremony that would reshape the very foundations of how different species dealt with conflict. Ambassador Lim Miho stood at the center of it all, not as a conquering general, but as an architect building something entirely new. The formal surrender documents lay spread across the ancient ceremonial table, but these weren't just papers ending a war. They were blueprints for a different kind of galactic future. Representatives from dozens of species filled the hall, the same delegates who had witnessed the massacre of the Rillan colony ships months earlier. But now they looked at the human diplomat with a mixture of deep respect and careful wariness that hadn't existed before the war began. Co. Jin Wan, the legal expert who had crafted the surrender terms, approached with the final documents. His work had gone far beyond simple military capitulation. Every clause had been designed to prevent future conflicts, while giving the former Valtor worlds a path toward redemption. "The restructuring protocols are complete," he reported quietly. "Each former Imperial world will become an independent system with built-in safeguards against military aggression. They'll be unable to build offensive fleets or establish military alliances for at least 50 years. Miho nodded, studying the documents one final time. The Valtor Empire's remnant worlds wouldn't be punished into poverty. They would be transformed into something better. But they would never again have the power to threaten peaceful species. Captain Park Soo-yun stepped forward, wearing the new uniform of the Galactic Mediation Corps. The peacekeeping force she would command was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of crushing military superiority, it would rely on the coalition networks that Miho had built during the war. "We have confirmed volunteers from 43 different species," she announced. "Human diplomats will serve as neutral mediators, but the enforcement will come from the same alliance system that brought down the Empire." It was brilliant in its simplicity. No single species would dominate the new peacekeeping force, but humanity's gift for understanding complex relationships would guide how conflicts were resolved. Former Supreme Commander Thexval stood before the assembly, stripped of his ornate military decorations and the arrogance that had once defined him. The reptilian officer who had dismissed the massacre of innocent families as pest control now faced judgment from the very species he had considered inferior. Miho's voice was calm and professional as he read the surrender terms, but everyone present could hear the iron behind his words. "The former Valtor Empire hereby surrenders all claims to military supremacy and accepts permanent oversight by the Galactic Mediation Corps." There were no cheers or celebrations. This wasn't a moment for triumph. It was a foundation stone of a new kind of galactic civilization. Lim Gaeaon, who had been appointed Director of Galactic Intelligence Sharing, was already implementing the networks that would prevent future genocides. The same information systems that had brought down the Valtor Empire would now serve a different purpose. "No empire will ever again be able to hide preparations for mass murder," she explained to the assembled delegates. "The intelligence sharing protocols will ensure that genocidal plans are exposed before they can be implemented." The species that had once dismissed humanity as naive idealists now listened with careful attention. They had learned that when humans spoke of peace, they meant it absolutely, and when that peace was violated, the response would reshape the very structure of galactic civilization. But perhaps the most important figure in the hall was Jung Haen, the new director of reconstruction efforts. Her job would be the hardest of all, transforming former Valtor worlds from aggressive military states into productive members of the galactic community. "This isn't about punishment," she explained to the former Imperial representatives. "This is about transformation. Within a generation, your world will be prosperous again, but they'll be prosperous through cooperation, not conquest." The reconstruction plan was ambitious beyond anything the galaxy had ever attempted. Former military factories would be converted to produce agricultural equipment and medical supplies. Military academies would become universities focused on peaceful sciences. Entire planets would be rebuilt around cooperation instead of domination. As the ceremony concluded and delegates began to file out, Miho remained in the Great Hall for a few moments longer. Through the massive windows, he could see Valtor Prime's capital city spread out below. Once it had been the center of an empire built on fear and violence. Soon it would be something entirely different. Kim Soo-young approached, carrying reports from across the galaxy. "The first Mediation Corps teams are already deploying to 3 different conflict zones," she reported. Early indications suggest the new protocols are working. Miho smiled slightly. The war was over, but his true victory was just beginning. Peace wasn't simply the absence of fighting. It was a complex system that had to be built, maintained, and protected by those who understood its true value. The galaxy was about to discover what peace looked like when it was designed by humans who had learned that sometimes the greatest weapon against aggression was the patient work of building something better.